90 miles. That is the only thing separating the most powerful naval weapon ever built from an island that has been preparing to fight it since before most Americans were born. And the question nobody in Washington is asking out loud is not whether the United States could win. It is whether the United States could survive winning. Stay with me, because what I am about to show you changes everything you think you know about this confrontation. The USS Abraham Lincoln carries 90 aircraft, displaces over 100,000 tons, and travels with a strike group that holds more firepower than most national militaries combined. Donald Trump stood on the South Lawn on May 1st and told reporters that carrier could swing by Cuba on its way back from the Persian Gulf and end the regime in minutes. He was smiling when he said it. The press laughed. 48 hours later, Cuba mobilized 300,000 reservists for the first time since the Soviet Union collapsed. Let that land for a second. Not 3,000. Not 30,000. 300,000. That is not a country panicking. That is a country activating a plan it has been rehearsing for 65 years. If you are finding this breakdown useful, hit like right now, because the algorithm buries this kind of analysis, and I need your help getting it out. Vietnam. The United States had total air superiority, total naval superiority, total technological superiority. It lost. Iraq. The invasion took 3 weeks. The occupation took 8 years and produced no stable outcome. Afghanistan. 20 years. $2 trillion. The Taliban were back in power before the last American helicopter cleared the ground. In every single case, the stronger military won every battle and lost the war, not because the enemy was powerful, because the enemy was willing to outlast. Here is what that history means for Cuba right now, and the answer is not what the Pentagon wants anyone saying publicly. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published a brief on May 4th that the headlines almost completely ignored. What it said was this: Cuba has spent 6 decades constructing a civil defense infrastructure built around one specific assumption: America will come. Underground bunkers from the Cold War, munitions depots embedded across the island, militia training integrated into schools and workplaces since childhood. The CSIS comparison was not vague. It named Vietnam and Afghanistan directly. 2 wars where the United States had overwhelming military dominance and walked away without achieving a single political objective. Not because the enemy matched American firepower, because the enemy made the cost of staying higher than the value of winning. Cuba's military doctrine since 1961 has operated on the same logic. You do not stop the invader on the beach. You make every day after the beach more expensive than the day before. You fight until the occupier's own population demands withdrawal. When Cuba's ambassador stood on live television and said his country would fight with rifles if necessary, he was not describing a weapons system. He was describing a 65-year strategy with a documented track record, and that is the part of this story that should concern everyone watching, regardless of where you stand politically. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you think Trump was joking, running psychological pressure, or actually considering military options. I want to know what this audience thinks, because the range of answers I am seeing is extraordinary. Now here is the layer that almost no outlet is covering. The 300,000 reservists serve 2 purposes simultaneously. The first is military. Cuba is signaling that any landing force will not face 49,000 regular soldiers. It will face hundreds of thousands of armed civilians embedded in neighborhoods, buildings, and streets. Every block becomes a defensive position. The distinction between combatant and civilian collapses. That is the scenario that appears in every classified nightmare assessment for urban occupation. The second purpose is domestic. Diaz-Canel's government has been hemorrhaging legitimacy for 3 straight years. Power blackouts lasting 20 hours, food shortages across the island, public protests that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. An external military threat does something no economic policy can do. It gives a desperate population a reason to unite behind the flag instead of against the government. Which means Diaz-Canel may be the one person in this entire confrontation who politically benefits from escalation continuing. Think about what that means for how this situation resolves. There is a contradiction sitting at the center of the American position that nobody in this administration has addressed publicly. Trump's remarks implied a decapitation strike. Remove the leadership. The system collapses. Cuba becomes free. But the same day he made those comments, CENTCOM confirmed the Abraham Lincoln would remain on station in the Persian Gulf through at least June. A Pentagon spokesperson told CBS News on May 2nd there are no current orders to redeploy the carrier to the Caribbean. The operational reality and the presidential rhetoric are moving in opposite directions. And beneath that contradiction is a question the administration's own analysts have been asking internally for months. What does the United States actually gain from invading Cuba? Cuba has no oil. No strategic minerals in quantities that justify military action, no nuclear program, no weapons of mass destruction. Its military poses zero conventional threat to the American mainland. The only available justification is ideological. Finish what the Bay of Pigs failed to do in 1961. Former defense officials who spoke to CSIS have said consistently that military planners across multiple administrations have recommended against invasion unless the threat to American security is existential. Rifles and Kalashnikovs do not meet that threshold. Here is the scenario that Coast Guard planners are quietly running and that no one in the administration will discuss on record. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. 11 million people. If the government collapses during an invasion, the migration math becomes catastrophic in ways that collapse the administration's own domestic platform. The Mariel boat lift in 1980 brought 125,000 Cubans to American shores in 6 months and destabilized South Florida for years. The Balsero crisis in 1994 put 35,000 people on rafts in weeks. Current analyst estimates for a full collapse scenario suggest an exodus 10 to 15 times the 1980 wave. Over 1 million people attempting to cross 90 miles of open water in anything that floats. The Coast Guard interdicted over 6,000 Cuban migrants last year during a period of relative stability. It does not have the capacity to manage 100,000, let alone 1 million. The administration that built its entire political identity on stopping immigration would, through its own military action, trigger the largest refugee crisis the Western Hemisphere has seen in modern history. And Cuba is an island. There is no land border for a gradual, manageable crossing. There is water. And desperate people in large numbers on water produce images that no political operation can contain. Bodies on beaches, children in overcrowded vessels, Coast Guard ships turning people away within sight of the Florida coast. That is what this looks like on day 2. Not in Havana. In Key West. Strip away the carrier and the rifles and the television statements and ask the structural question. Why did Trump say this? 3 possibilities exist, and none of them are reassuring. The first is that it was a genuine rhetorical flourish, a show of strength for the press pool with no operational intent. The White House said as much. The problem is that a president's words about military force against a sovereign nation are never just words. Cuba mobilized. Latin American governments issued formal statements of concern. International media treated the remarks as a policy signal. The consequences of the joke were real, whether the joke was real or not. The second possibility is deliberate psychological pressure. make Diaz-Canel believe invasion is plausible, so the economic strangulation feels more urgent. The carrier threat amplifies the sanctions. The sanctions make the carrier threat credible. Each one multiplies the other. That is consistent with the maximum pressure framework this administration has applied across every other theater. The third possibility is the one that changes everything. Trump was testing the reaction: domestic, congressional, international. If the response is manageable, the option stays active. If the blowback is too severe, it disappears quietly. Either way, the data is collected and the option is filed. All three scenarios produce the same immediate outcome. Cuba is now operating under the assumption that invasion is a live possibility, and a government that believes invasion is coming does not liberalize. It does not negotiate its own exit. It hardens, it mobilizes, it crushes internal dissent because dissent in wartime is treason. Whatever space existed for peaceful transition inside Cuba has narrowed significantly since May 1st. Trump's remarks, joke or strategy or trial balloon, have made the outcome they were presumably designed to accelerate less likely, not more. The rifles are not pointing at a carrier. They are pointing at a future that Washington just made harder to reach. Cuba has been rehearsing this specific scenario since 1961. After the Bay of Pigs, the entire civil defense infrastructure was rebuilt around one principle: make invasion so costly that Washington will never complete it, not by matching American firepower, by ensuring that day 90 is more expensive than day 1, and day 300 is more expensive than day 90, and day 1000 makes the entire enterprise politically unsurvivable at home. That is not Cuban theory. It is Vietnamese strategy. It is Afghan strategy. It is the strategy that has ended every American occupation in the modern era, and it has worked with remarkable consistency, not because America's enemies are strong, but because America's tolerance for indefinite occupation is finite, and its enemies know exactly how to measure it. Cuba adds one additional variable that makes it uniquely dangerous as an occupation target. It is an island. There is no land border through which insurgents receive quiet resupply, but there is also no land border through which American forces quietly withdraw. Every exit requires the ocean. Every departure is visible. Every retreat is televised. And in American politics, the optics of leaving determine whether a military action is remembered as a success or a catastrophe. The Pentagon has contingency plans for Cuba. They have been updated every decade. The consistent recommendation across every administration that has reviewed them is the same: do not invade unless the threat is existential. Rifles and Kalashnikovs against a carrier strike group is not an existential threat. It is a guarantee of a long, bloody, politically toxic occupation with no defined endpoint and no clean exit. History does not say the rifles win on day 1. It says the rifles win on day 1000, and the United States has never yet found a way to make day 1000 not arrive. Here is what the record shows as of today. Trump told reporters the Abraham Lincoln could end Cuba's government in minutes. Cuba's ambassador said his country would fight with rifles. 300,000 reservists have been activated for the first time since the Soviet collapse. The Pentagon has confirmed no current orders to move the carrier toward the Caribbean. CSIS has documented that Cuba has spent 65 years preparing for exactly this confrontation. Every American occupation since Vietnam has exceeded its projected cost and duration. An invasion would trigger a refugee crisis the Coast Guard cannot contain by a factor of 10 or more. And the administration has not publicly explained what the plan looks like after day 1. What remains unknown is whether the carrier moves, whether the remarks were a joke, a pressure campaign, or a trial balloon. And whether anyone in the room where these decisions get made has read the after-action reports from the last 3 countries the United States expected to liberate quickly. Military superiority is not military victory. The United States has demonstrated the first with overwhelming consistency for 80 years. The last 60 have been spent demonstrating at enormous cost that the second requires something firepower cannot manufacture. One side has a 100,000-ton carrier. The other side has 11 million people, 65 years of preparation, and nowhere to go. The carrier can leave, the island cannot. And in every modern conflict where one side could leave and the other could not, history has been consistent about which side was still there when it ended. Here is my question for this audience, and I mean it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. At what point does asymmetric resistance stop being a historical pattern and start functioning as a credible deterrent in real time? Cuba says rifles. The Pentagon's own planners say do not invade. Does it matter if neither voice is the loudest one in the room? Tell me in the comments. The analysis in this community has been some of the sharpest I have encountered on this topic, and this is the video where it matters most. If this reframed how you see this confrontation, one tap on the like button is what pushes it past the algorithm. We update this analysis daily as the situation develops, so if you want the next chapter as soon as it publishes, subscribe now and hit the bell. This story is not finished, and the next development may be the one that changes every calculation on the table.